Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about how education is key. Let's get started. For some of my long-term listeners, you remember that I, by profession, am a teacher. For those of you who are somewhat new to the podcast, if you go back, you can hear a bunch of my episodes in regards to teaching. But on today's episode, I kind of wanted to pick up on somewhere we started quite a while ago, and also talk about how it's relevant today and how things are changing for the better and for the worse, depending where you are in the world. I know recently we've been talking all about the things going on in Syria and in Israel and the world, and these are very important, no doubt, and there's always updates to talk about. But today's episode, I really wanted to focus on this very small and seemingly insignificant news in the Middle East, and also why it's important for us to know in our society, in the West, because I think that the West is actually doing the wrong thing right now and not taking an example from Arab countries. In one of our previous episodes called Gaza and De-radicalization, it's episode 99 if you want to go back and listen another time, we talked about how important it is that education needs to change if you plan on getting rid of an ideology. For example, in that episode, we talk about Nazism in Germany and how it essentially was wiped out. One of the main ways that they were able to wipe out Nazism, which was an incredibly strong pull for the people of Germany at the time, was by changing the education system. An education system that was set up purposefully by the Nazis in order to indoctrinate their youth. And this is no different than what we see in the Middle East. It's actually, ironically, an extension of the issues that went on in Germany. As we've talked about on previous podcasts, many of my listeners may remember that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the man who was unofficially in charge of the British Mandate of Palestine's Arab population, spent much of his time during World War II in Germany with Hitler, getting ideas and making sure that he brings them back home. They both agreed on one thing: Jew hate. So it's no surprise that we see similar issues like, for example, making sure to indoctrinate your youth using the education system, a direct connection from Nazi Germany right to the Arab world. But another thing that many people don't know, and I've been meaning to do a full podcast on this at one point, but I'll give you a little taste here, is that just after World War II, when Israel was reestablished as a state, and at the same time, if you know your history, you know that the Cold War is taking place. And there's this big pull between which countries are going to align with the American Western ideas and which countries are going to be part of the Soviet Union. And not surprisingly, initially, Israel leaned a little bit towards the Soviet side. If you know much about the initial founders of Israel, many of them were socialist in nature. That's why we have kibbutzim, the communal living style that is very prominent in Israel even today. Communist and socialist ideas were running through that country from the beginning. So it was assumed by the Soviet Union that this new Israeli state would be part of the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere of influence. This was so assumed by the Soviet Union that they actually were one of the first countries to vote in favor of the UN resolution to create the state of Israel, because they assumed it would be a Soviet state. Boy, were they angry at the Israelis when it turns out that the Israeli government decided that they rather be part of the Western sphere of influence and be much closer ties to the United States. This couldn't go unpunished. According to testimony from former KGB agents who have left Russia and now live in the United States, there was an active plan by the KGB to influence the world against the Jewish state. How dare you not accept our sphere of influence and go with our enemy? So an active push in the Arab world especially was made to delegitimize Israel, to teach the Arab world that Israel is a bunch of colonizers. And now you understand why they say we are the little Satan and America is the big Satan. This is all Soviet propaganda to demonize the Jewish people, claim they didn't belong here, and that they are a colony of the West. And this KGB education that they gave to pretty much every single Arab country in the entire region has stayed and is still being taught today. This education that shows that Israel didn't exist, that Israel's not on the map, that Israel's a bunch of colonizers, revisionist history, these are all leftovers from the education system in the Arab world created by the KGB. But what's amazing is something that floated a little bit under the radar this week due to all the other chaos that's going on in the world. Egypt has finally officially removed anti-Semitism from their school textbooks. Egypt has announced that their very long stage of removing anti-Semitism from their textbooks is nearly 80% complete. That 80% of students now in Egypt are learning a very different message about Israel. There's less whitewashing of history. There's less demonizing of Jews and talking about martyrdom and stolen land. And the reason for this is clearly because not only is it not true, but it doesn't lend itself to have good cooperation and collaboration between people who are being taught to hate Jews and then expecting some type of peaceful border. I really hate to point out the obvious fact that some of you may have already figured out, that Egypt has had a peace with Israel since 1979, but only now is getting rid of the anti-Semitism in their textbooks. I guess a win is a win, even if it took a little too long. But what is really amazing is that more countries have done the exact same thing. We have seen various countries in the Middle East starting to slowly remove the anti-Semitism and the anti-Israel messages from their textbooks. They are no longer teaching their students to hate Jews. And this is monumental. Think about it. It has literally been in their textbooks, taught to their kids for over 70 years. And it's kind of common knowledge what happens when you teach kids in school about hating Jews. When they grow up, they tend to hate Jews. And it's not a coincidence that under the Abraham Accords, places like the United Arab Emirates, who now has peace or normalization with Israel, removed anti-Semitism and anti-Israel messaging from their textbooks a number of years ago in order to de-radicalize their own people and allow themselves to have a peace with Israel. And let's not forget the Saudi deal with Israel to normalize. That could not be possible if they didn't remove the anti-Semitism from their children's textbooks. And they know that. They did it too. It seems like it should be common knowledge that you don't educate your young people through textbooks in a certain way if you don't want them to believe those things when they're older. So therefore, if we no longer want our society to be anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and have all this hate, and we want to actually succeed and have partnerships and allyships with Israel and trade technologies and medicine and allow for tourism, you will stop teaching those things. So let's just assume that that's common sense and that everyone eventually will get to that point. And yet, for some reason, we can all accept the idea that you don't want to teach your kids to hate someone, but UN, through the UNRWA or the Palestinian Refugee Agency, is creating and printing anti-Semitic books to hand out to their students in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria and Gaza. But we all expect for there to be a peace process. We're not going to go into that today because we've already talked about that a little bit in the Gaza de-radicalization episode. Please go back and listen to that if you want more details. But it's so interesting to see that pretty much everyone can agree that de-radicalization comes from education. Education is key. But what amazes me the most is that while the Arab world, not all of it, but a lot of it, is turning to de-radicalization, incredibly, we are seeing the exact opposite in the West. While the moderate Islamic countries are trying to remove the anti-Semitism from their schools and their textbooks, we are seeing American Western universities, high schools, elementary schools in the West, all adding more and more anti-Semitism into their schools. It is just honestly mind-blowing to think that as the other side of the world that we kind of identify as anti-Semitic, anti-Israel for their own reasons, they are now trying to get themselves out of that brainwashing through their education. And North America, we are adding brainwashing to get people more anti-Semitic and more anti-Israel. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the entire list of anti-Semitic actions on university campuses across the West. We've gone through that countless times on this podcast. And I think I've mentioned before on the podcast how some of this also stems directly from the KGB. Their anti-Israel propaganda is purposely put into these institutions over the last many years. But let's look at maybe a little bit younger education systems. We have seen online and pretty much everywhere in the news about anti-Semitism happening in schools for high school students and for elementary school students. It is unbelievable the amount of anti-Semitic acts happening in schools across the entire West of all ages. Now, we could chalk this up to the crazy, useful, idiot people in university going to teachers' colleges and learning to be educators who bring from college those anti-Semitic ideas and put them either maybe subtly or overtly into their lesson plans. We've seen some very disgusting things on Instagram recently of teachers doing very terrible things, like those teachers who wear keffiyehs to school to symbolize their support for terrorism, not to mention alienate their Jewish students. But this is a coordinated effort to change the narrative, to install this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel ideology into young people's schools. The only difference between us in the West and the people overseas is that it's not in our textbooks yet. It is the teacher and the system that is putting anti-Semitism into the classrooms and also not addressing when anti-Semitism happens, which allows it to continue to happen and for Jewish people to feel even more marginalized. I can give you a few examples from my own experience. I'm in Canada, and therefore I hear more about Canadian education news as opposed to American, but I'm sure this is happening all across America as well. On one of our earlier podcasts, I discussed the issue of a Canadian teacher, someone from the Toronto District School Board, who got caught bringing her students to a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel rally and claimed the field trip was for something else. She lied to the parents, told them they were doing something else, and then brought them knowingly to a pro-Palestinian rally and had them join in with the chants and make sure that they participated fully. Apparently, an email surfaced where this teacher told all of the students to bring their masks and face coverings just in case because there might be press there, knowingly bringing kids to a place that they needed to hide their identities for without telling the parents. The Toronto District School Board shortly after condemned this and said they were going to, quote, look into it. I don't have a lot of faith in that. But ironically, or maybe not ironically, the Toronto District School Board not too long after had a meeting for parents in order to discuss issues of anti-Semitism and, of course, Islamophobia. And thanks to some activist parents, or I assume parents, they could just be community members, decided that they wanted to add to the discrimination code of the Toronto District School Board anti-Palestinian racism. If you want a little more information on this incident, you can look into our episode Anti-Zionism and Islamophobia. But the point of this is that the system itself, after an anti-Semitic incident happened, added, for some reason, anti-Palestinian racism to their code of conduct. So the next time that the teacher takes their students to a pro-Palestinian rally and someone complains, they get to call you an anti-Palestinian racist. So rather than take this anti-Semitic issue seriously, they decided to systemically make sure to protect the anti-Semitism that happens in their schools by labeling it anti-Palestinian racism, because being a proud Jew makes you anti-Palestinian somehow. I have seen myself the incidents of racism, anti-Semitism, all of these things in my own school. Unfortunately, I can't go into too much detail, but let me just say that I have seen personally the administrators being so careful to not offend someone who's anti-Semitic that they let them off with barely even a punishment because the administration and even the system is so afraid to call out anti-Semitism because it is seen as not as big of a deal, or maybe it, quote, depends on the context versus any other form of racism. If I was, as an administrator, to punish someone for saying or doing something anti-Semitic, I might get in trouble for, let's say, restricting their rights to free speech. They are allowed to be anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, people are so afraid to call out anti-Semitism that they just sort of push it under the rug and say it's free speech or it depends on the context. Despite the fact that anti-Semitism is on the rise exponentially and has been an issue within even my school board for many, many years, they are still unwilling to deal with the problem. And most recently, they did what they thought was a smart idea, doing a professional development day on anti-Semitism within our schools, ironically teamed up with Islamophobia because one cannot be heard without the other, just to make sure we shield the people who are anti-Semitic from being blamed for being anti-Semitic, because they too are victims of Islamophobia, and therefore they can't be blamed for being anti-Semitic. They too are victims. And to watch the downplaying of anti-Semitism, the somewhat ignoring of anti-Semitism, the very sterile way that they just listed off some facts about anti-Semitism, meanwhile putting all kinds of heart and emotional testimony from the students who have faced legitimately Islamophobia, which is wrong. The two next to each other couldn't be more obvious that they are trying to downplay the anti-Semitism and upplay the emotional issues that happen for the Muslim students in our school board, which, don't get me wrong, is a very justifiable issue. It's just that both are equally important and should have their own separate days. In the end, we see how important education is to the indoctrination or the unindoctrination of students. Everybody from Hitler to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to the Soviets knew how important education is to indoctrinate kids, to get them on your side. All the best dictators and crazy people do it. The amazing thing is that we're seeing the Arab world, not entirely, getting rid of their indoctrination, of starting to open the minds of their students for peace and prosperity and equality among different religions. The UAE has been nothing short of amazing in the way that they have embraced the Abraham Accords. And meanwhile, while the other side of the world is sort of figuring this out, the West is starting to do the exact opposite, where we are seeing anti-Semitism in classrooms, we are seeing teachers actively promoting anti-Israel things and getting away with it. We see a system that is putting in place barriers to ignore anti-Semitism and downplay anti-Semitism because you have a right to not have someone be mean against you as a Palestinian by being pro-Israel. And I've also mentioned on this podcast another school board within Canada that added Nakba Day to promote an anti-Semitic ideology about the independence of the State of Israel as official policy, as an official day, as something that teachers will have to teach about, including the Jewish teachers. We are seeing the complete erosion of Jewish rights and the Jewish people in these countries in the West. We are going to soon find out what happens when you indoctrinate your kids. We might already be seeing it on the streets of New York and Los Angeles and the entire world, all these anti-Semitic people coming out for protests. But what we need to address in the West is that education is key. Education will help us get rid of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and any other form of hate. Installing these types of hate in school as school policy is definitely a dumb idea. Maybe we should finally, for once, take a page out of the Arab playbook and start taking this stuff out of our education system. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.